Hey, Emily.
Hi, I was just going to give people a couple of minutes and then I'll do your intro and we'll get started.
No worries. No worries. Is it pouring where you are?
Yeah.
It's just pouring.
hmm It's fall in the mountains.
It is indeed. It is indeed.
It's going to get really cold this weekend. Finally.
Yay. I'm actually planning to drive out your way and pick up more of those apple turnovers because they were
Oh,
really
good.
delicious. So,
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and at least start your intro and then that'll give folks a couple of minutes. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our fourth installment of our Lunch and Learn series on election 2020. My name is Emily Sears, and I am the Civic Engagement Fellow for Queen's University of Charlotte. And the purpose of this webinar is to speak with experts about the offices and issues that are at stake in this election, or any election for that matter. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to post them in the chat box. We might have a couple of minutes at the end to address those, and so I will facilitate that question answer opportunity. And if you want to reference this webinar again, we will have a recording of it posted on our website within the next couple of days. And Jen will post that link in the chat box so that you can save it. And you can also follow along with all of our updates and events and a number of things that we are doing on our Instagram page, which is at QU_votes. But now we will transition to what we actually came here today to talk about. We are excited to welcome Dr. Alexa Royden to our series. Dr. Royden has been engaged in international and transnational security for over 20 years. After working as a defense analyst for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, she completed her PhD at the University of St. Andrews. She currently studies social cohesion in divided and post-conflict societies and teaches courses on global conflict, U.S. foreign policy, and international law organization. I have taken most of these courses, so if you are a Queen's student, you should sign up for her classes. Thank you, Dr. Royden, for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
all righty. Okay, I'm hoping my mute is off and everything is working. I was in the middle of class last night when Microsoft had its meltdown and everything got kicked off. So fingers crossed this goes better today. What I'm going to do is really quickly do an overview of sort of the environment in which US foreign policy works. And then I'm going to move on to some of the changes taken place. And I'm going to do my best to leave some time at the end for questions, because I know this is a really quick lunchtime sort of tutorial on US foreign policy and the election, but I imagine you all have some questions and I'm happy to answer those. So I thought I'd start by pointing out that since World War II, the United States has really been instrumental in shaping the world order. Okay, so at the end of World War II, the United States really took the lead in investing resources and rebuilding Europe, Japan, etc. We forged really powerful alliances. We created partnerships that endure to this day, many of which predated that, but still are incredibly and vitally important. We built out the international institutions that shape the global environment, from the United Nations to the World Trade Organization to the World Health Organization. There are many multilateral treaties that we were deeply involved in writing and getting passed. So for all intents and purposes, the United States has been deeply committed to this global experiment that emerged at the end of World War II. And throughout the Cold War, new organizations emerged like NATO, and certainly it has to be noted that the global economy is really very much designed and for many years supported by U.S. Participation in groups like the World Trade Organization, et cetera. So we have very much been focused on the construction of this system, and it serves us. Even though it is a deeply imperfect system and various administrations have had differing opinions about its utility and how to interact with it, overall, it has created a leadership position for the United States in the world that has been incredibly powerful and has served us very, very well. And as part of that, again, we have been staunch supporters of free trade, spreading democracy, both peacefully and sometimes less peacefully. And, things like the human rights agenda, those have been really key points, sort of cornerstones to US foreign policy. So we very much have led this and have benefited from it. And that's why I'm going to say something a little controversial, and that is, for the most part, foreign policy between presidential administrations doesn't change that much, okay? And it doesn't change as much as we think it does because of this existing operating environment that we built, right, to serve us to some extent. But it also doesn't change because we have a lot of foreign policy elites who really influence the foreign policy process. Oftentimes, actually more often than not, when a president comes into office, he, and hopefully one day she, has had very little experience in foreign policy. I would say in the last administrations, probably the exception to that would be George H.W. Bush, who walked in with an enormous amount of foreign policy experience. But it's the exception, not the rule. So foreign policy elites have very much shaped US foreign policy and how we engage in the world. There's also the fact that foreign policy is dictated by external events. The one truism is that no US president gets the foreign policy emergencies that he anticipates, right? So, certainly George Bush did not want 9/11. Bill Clinton didn't want the genocide in Rwanda. These are things that happen and we have to respond to, okay? And our foreign policy elites tend to help us create a consistent foreign policy there. And that's actually really important because, again, the United States has been a consistent and fairly predictable actor in the global system since the end of the Cold War. At the end of World War II. Now, with the end of the Cold War, things got a little bit more complicated because we no longer had a very clear strategic focus. And our foreign policy really lost some of its strategic focus, in the years following that. That being said, it was still fairly consistent, fairly reliable, and the United States was deeply committed to this leadership role that it has played. So that's a little bit of the backstory. I'm happy to answer any questions you have on that. But what is noteworthy with the Trump administration is, for the first time in a really long time, you are seeing a significant departure from the assumptions that organize US foreign policy. In many instances, the Trump administration has simply flatly rejected the system that the United States has built. Everything from free trade agreements to multilateral institutions to existing treaties and treaties that we were in the process of negotiating. And for many reasons, the Trump administration rejected it because it believed that it wasn't serving US interests. Now, that's certainly a point worth debating, but it is a radical departure. So I would say that for the first time in generations, the United States is stepping back in its role as world, as leader of the, sort of global order. Now, is it time for that to happen? Certainly worth debating. But the United States has been for a very long time considered the indispensable power. And what that means isn't that we're the most important power, it's that we often need to be at the table to get things to happen. Okay, so if you are negotiating, say, a treaty on global warming, the United States is never going to ratify that treaty, but you also know the United States needs to be part of negotiating it because we are a big part of the global order. The Trump administration has chosen to walk away from many of those things, which has created a power vacuum. And what's very interesting is that instead of people realizing, or other states in the system, our allies, our treaty partners, instead of those initiatives going away, they've simply carried on. And this is actually, I would argue, a very, very important shift. because since World War II, the world assumed they needed the United States. They were the indispensable power. They needed to be at the table. And I think, for good or ill, the world is learning that the United States doesn't have to be there. I don't think that was the intent of the Trump administration. I don't think their intent was to create a power vacuum that other states would slowly begin to fill. But for all intents and purposes, that's what we're observing. I think it's noteworthy that just this last month in Foreign Policy magazine, which is a major foreign policy publication, two leading experts in US foreign policy wrote an article. I think I wrote it down here because it struck me. They wrote an article entitled, "The US is not entitled to lead the world." Now, these are our own guys. And this would not have been an article that was written even a decade ago. So it's worth noting that this is a major foreign policy shift for the United States. Now, the question then becomes, is this good, bad, indifferent? I mean, is it a big deal? What does it matter? And I think that the jury is out. The jury is out. The United States was in the process of seeing, or the global order was in the process of seeing new actors emerge who were challenging the United States in terms of our dominance of the world system. And those new actors are China, certainly to some, certainly the EU as a bloc is a competitor of the United States, and other rising states who have increasingly powerful economic roles to play, as well as have a say in how security works in this world. So our stepping back from this traditional role is going to have consequences. The question, of course, is what are those consequences going to be? And did the Trump administration offer an alternative vision? And that's very much where we're sort of running into problems. The Trump administration has a case to be made that, the United States could be better served by shifting its foreign policy in important ways. The foreign policy elite certainly suffers from groupthink. It's really hard to get the foreign policy elite to shift on a lot of issues, and arguably they have too much influence. The problem is that the Trump administration really didn't replace the existing strategic vision for the United States. They have very much resulted in a chaotic foreign policy, okay? So it's important to note that what has resulted in place of this vision of US leadership and free trade and democracy promotion and human rights agenda, et cetera, has been fairly chaotic and inconsistent. And that's been a problem because the chaos results in an erosion of trust in the United States around the world. At this point in time, our allies don't know what to believe or what to expect. Partly this is because there's been a high level of turnover in US foreign policy leadership, whether it's the National Security Advisor, the Department, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State. There's been an unusually high level of turnover. We have a number of people serving as interim appointments in key positions. We have a lot of positions within the State Department that have not been filled at all. Okay, so you're seeing an erosion in the expertise that guides our foreign policy. There's also been just an enormous exodus at the Department of State. US foreign policy professionals have just left. And that leaves us, again, with a dearth of truly experienced foreign policy professionals. So you have this chaos at the top, all right, which leads to instability, and it leads to an erosion of trust in our vital relationships that guide our ability to respond to crises. So again, the question is, has the indispensable nation become fairly dispensable? And what happens next? When the Trump administration, when Trump leaves the administration, whether it's this year or in 2024, will the United States be able to reclaim its role in the world? Will the United States be able to manage that erosion of trust? Will the United States be able to rebuild some of these relationships that have been put under stress. The key relationships, I would argue, that really are stressed today are our relationships with the European Union and our NATO allies. There is an enormous amount of stress there. For instance, the other day, Secretary Pompeo made the announcement that the United Nations was going to reimpose sanctions against Iran. And the United Nations had not made that determination. None of our allies had made that determination. And nobody paid any attention to Secretary Pompeo. They just kept on doing what they were doing, right? So the United States senior figure in foreign policy is making policy announcements that the world is ignoring. And that's a problem, okay? So you have issues with our relationship with our European partners, but we also have dramatically changed relationships with potential competitors. For instance, we have a significantly changed relationship with China. We have a significantly changed relationship with North Korea. And of course, we have a significantly changed relationship with Iran. Probably of all of our relationships, the one that will be most difficult to recoup is the agreement we had in place with Iran. Both North Korea and Iran today are in a much better position to go nuclear when, in Iran's case. North Korea already has nuclear weapons, but North Korea's program has advanced significantly. So these are different strategic situations that either the second Trump administration or a new president will face. The strategic picture is shifting. So that has all sounded very dire. and I want to give credit where credit is due. Shaking up the US foreign policy establishment isn't all bad, all right? I think that there are a lot of foreign policy professionals who welcome a shift in tone with China, who welcome a more hardline stance with China in certain areas such as intellectual property, etc. So I think reimagining our relationship with the Chinese is really important, and this is an opportunity to do that. There certainly, our policy with China has been inconsistent lately, but there are new opportunities, and that's something that should certainly be recognized. I would also say, and something that genuinely surprised me, and I'm still not sure what quite to make of it, but having both the UAE and Bahrain recognize Israel is potentially a game changer for that region. We'll see what happens next. We'll see if it stops with these two states or if you see additional Arab states recognize Israel. The strategic environment in the Middle East is shifting. And what we're starting to see is, an alignment of the states that support Iran and the states that support Saudi Arabia. And that shift could be really important, or it might not. Right? So if Israel manages to create some sort of alliance with new Arab partners in the region against Iran, that changes the game. We're not there yet. And so I really have absolutely no ability to predict what's going on, but it is worth noting that these two shifts in diplomatic status, the recognition of Israel by two new Arab states, is important. And the Trump administration accomplished that. Will it be good for the United States? Will it be good for the region? I don't know yet, but it is a change in an area that has been stalemated for a really long time. So really quickly, what happens next? I'm not sure, but what we're really facing at this point is, with a second Trump administration, you're likely to see US status around the world continue to erode and the United States continue to step back from this global order that we constructed after World War II. With a Biden administration, you're likely to see the United States try to just reset that and start over. I'm just not convinced that we're going to be able to do that. Once the world learns that they don't need to have you at the table, they don't need to always have you at the table. And that's a pretty significant shift for the US, who has really been able to leverage its status as indispensable for 70 years. So this is a big shift. I will pause there because I think it gives us about 10 minutes for questions. I don't know if there are any questions, but
yes, there are questions.
Okay, then I'm happy to take some.
Great. So one of the questions that came through said, do you see a lack of foreign policy experience as a hindrance for certain processes and engagements with other countries, for instance, with the crisis in Yemen and international environmental policy?
Yes, yes. Often, and here's the thing, again, many presidents don't have foreign policy coming into the game, and that's why the foreign policy community is so critically important. It's why the National Security Council is incredibly important. It's why the National Security Advisor is important. It's why you need to have, all of those people working at the State Department who have subject matter expertise in these regions. They need to be able to help you to make good decisions, or at least understand the operating environment. And we currently don't have that. And that has absolutely hindered our ability to respond. Yes.
Thank you. Another one asked, has the US lost its credibility? And I think you touched a little bit on that, but is the world waiting for a new administration, whenever that will be?
Yes, I think the world is waiting. We simply, because we have stepped back from our role, doesn't mean that the United States doesn't have a profound amount of capacity, that many states in the system don't rely on that capacity because they do. The United States continues to be incredibly important. So I think the world is waiting to see what happens. I'll give you an example. We are not going to be able to address COVID globally if we do not have a coordinated global response. Full stop. Viruses don't stop at borders. Even if the United States were miraculously able to effectively deal with its own COVID crisis within the next couple of months, and that's a totally different discussion. Even if we were able to do that, as long as other states in the system aren't able to effectively deal with their COVID crisis, means we still have it, because we're so deeply globalized that as people, as goods, as things move across borders, COVID's not going away. So it's incredibly important that the United States be involved in the COVID response overseas. The United States was deeply involved in the response to Ebola. We actually deployed military in the, what was it, 2011, roundabout there, the Ebola crisis. We actually deployed the military because they needed the capacity to address things like contact tracing and the ability to move supplies and all of this stuff that's critically important to dealing with a disease outbreak like Ebola or COVID. So the United States, by withdrawing from the WHO in the middle of an epidemic, that's a critical hit on our reputation. So, and it's a critical hit in the capacity of the world to respond to, to COVID, quite frankly. More people are going to die because the United States made that choice. And so, yes, I think the world is waiting to see what happens next. I think we all are, quite frankly.
Thank you for that. And another one is, what threat do you think China may have as a world power, and what might that mean for the US?
It's an interesting question, because I am skeptical about the assumption that China is inherently a threat. They are absolutely a competitor, and they do not always have goals that align with ours. And it is almost inevitable that we will run into them in certain places like the South China Sea. There is instability in that region. We have a very forward deployed military posture globally, but especially in the Pacific. I believe we have about 200,000 US soldiers, airmen, sailors, et cetera, deployed in that region. We spend a lot of time, energy, and money keeping the sea lanes open from the Persian Gulf up into East Asia. So we will run into each other inevitably, but I do not think that China has any interest in, open conflict with the United States, and I would hope the United States does not have any interest in open conflict with China. This is a diplomatic problem. A military encounter is not something that would benefit either one of us. So what do I think the threat from China is? I think the threat from China is that they offer a different vision of what the world can look like. And we are walking away from the vision that we created. When there is a power vacuum, somebody will fill it. So China is a competitor, and we need to realistically deal with that, not necessarily as a threat, but as a reality. So I'm not sure if I answered that question very well, but that's what I've got.
I think it made sense to me. So
There we go.
you're the China expert. As we look towards the election, can you talk a little bit more about the role that the president plays in making those political appointments, particularly those who work in national security and foreign policy, and then how those appointees shape a lot of the policies that come from the administration?
Absolutely. So at this point in time in any election, campaigns are working on their transition teams. So what they are doing is they are identifying people who will, it's a little early at this point, but you have a very short period of time between the election and the point at which a new president enters office to get hundreds of political appointees into positions. They all have to go through a security clearance process. Many of them already have security clearance, but still the point is that it's a big deal. Now, the Trump administration never actually finished that 4 years ago. We still have a lot of empty slots in foreign policy positions, and the National Security Council is, for all intents and purposes, pretty dysfunctional at this point. It is not being utilized in the way that it has historically been utilized. So a new president, or assuming the Trump administration continues, my recommendation is they need to rebuild that stuff. A new president needs to staff it out, and the Trump administration needs to fix it. Now, these new foreign policy elites will be guided by a national security strategy that either president will write, and that's the top guideline document. From there on, every institution, every organization, every agency associated with national security will promulgate its own set of guidelines keyed off of the national security strategy. And those, of course, will be worked out between the administration and the various agencies. So it's actually really important that you get good people in those positions because they play an incredibly vital role. This is a deeply complicated environment to work in, and you can't all do it with one or two people. There is a huge foreign policy apparatus, and there's a reason for it. It's not just waste, it's because we need those people. Yes, well, I'll stop there, but very important.
And finally, just to quickly round us out, you have talked a little bit about COVID and how that is impacting our role in the world. So going forward, depending on what happens in the election, how do you see our viewpoint on the World Health Organization maybe shift or remain the same?
I think with the Trump administration, you probably won't see much change. I could be wrong about that. I mean, I think that depending on how this next wave plays out in the United States, you might see some shift. I think that for all intents and purposes, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, the World Health Organization is deeply imperfect, but it's also what we've got. And what we also have right now is a global epidemic where over 1 million people have died, and over 200,000 people in the United States. We are being disproportionately affected. We need global coordination. So COVID if you see a new administration come in, I imagine that we would walk back the withdrawal from the World Health Organization and we double down coordination with them. That is what I would anticipate. So we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and knowledge with us today. Thank you everyone who joined us. Next week, we will have Dr. Mark Kelso, who will talk about environmental policy. And we will also have another session at 12:30 with Mr. Tom Moore, who is the Chief of Staff to Commissioner Ellen Weintraub of the Federal Election Commission. And he will be speaking about your vote at the federal level, the safety of the election, and American politics and money. So join us next week for our 5th installment, I think, of our Lunch and Learn series. Thank you so much, Dr. Royden.
No, thank you guys for having these. These have been great. Thank you.